Is anyone really out of place in a winter post office where the bell keeps chiming and the cold hums at the door? They mocked him under their breath, pressed by impatience as envelopes scraped across the counter. But when a small coin slipped from his coat and hit the tile with that sharp, echoing ring, the whole room fell into a silence so clear you could hear a heartbeat under the yellow porch light. Still quiet men leave echoes, too. Let me take you back. The morning cold settled softly over the Maple Junction post office, the kind of winter hush that made every sound feel a little sharper. The bell above the door chimed each time someone stepped inside, letting in a sweep of air that smelled faintly of snow and old cedar. Walt Marin moved with a slow steadiness behind the counter, sorting envelopes beneath the warm yellow light that pooled over his hands. His fingers weren't as quick as they used to be, and a few customers shifted their weight, glancing at one another as impatience rippled through the line. A man near the front sighed. A woman behind him whispered, "He's really out of place here," as if Walt couldn't hear, or as if the softness of her tone made the words any less sharp. Mark, the post office manager, stepped forward with a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Walt, you know this place moves faster when you're not at the counter." The sentence hung in the warm air, colder than the wind outside. Walt didn't argue. He simply nodded once, pushing his glasses up the bridge of his nose, then returned to the stack of mail as though the comment had rolled off him like water. But Emily, the small girl, clutching a pale blue envelope to her chest, heard every word. She watched Walt with the kind of focus children save for things adults overlook. She took a careful step forward. Her boots made a soft scuff on the old linoleum as the bell chimed again behind her. Walt turned slightly, offering her a gentle smile that touched the corners of his tired eyes. "Morning, sweetheart," he said quietly. Emily didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked at the way he moved, slow, deliberate, never rushing, even when the line grew longer. When he leaned down to place a package on the lower shelf, something in the breast pocket of his coat shifted. A faint glint caught the light, quick but bright enough for her to notice. She tilted her head, curious. Whatever it was, Walt seemed to tuck it away with a subtle, almost protective gesture. No one else saw it. No one else was looking at him long enough to. Behind them, another customer huffed. "Some of us have places to be." Walt murmured an apology and continued sorting. The warmth from the ceiling lamps washed over him, but the room still felt chilled by the quiet judgment moving through the line. Emily stepped closer to the counter, holding out her envelope with both hands. "Mr. Walt," she said softly, "I just want my letter to get to Grandma, quick." He glanced down at her small fingers wrapped around the envelope and gave her a nod that was gentle but sure. "I'll do my best," he said. In the brief pause that followed, the line reshuffled shoes scraping on the floor. The bell jingled again as someone stepped out in frustration. Walt didn't look up. Emily did. Her eyes moved from the doorway to the silver of Walt's pocket where she'd seen that tiny flicker. Something about it tugged at her, a quiet question waiting to be answered. And maybe she was the only one seeing him clearly. The line at the Maple Junction post office thickened as the morning stretched on the cold outside, nudging more people indoors and amplifying every small inconvenience. Boots tapped, jackets rustled, and low murmurs drifted between neighbors who were usually kinder when the days were longer. Today, though, patience wore thin. A man near the front leaned toward the woman beside him and muttered, "Why is he still here?" slowing everything down. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. It always did in a room built of wood and echoes. Walt Marin didn't look up. He simply shifted the stack of envelopes in his hands and continued sorting his movements, steady but unhurried. The overhead light cast a warm glow on his silver hair as he placed each item in its slot as though the rhythm itself held the room together. Emily stepped closer to the counter, her blue envelope hugged to her chest. The line parted slightly as she slipped through with quiet determination, stopping just where Walt could see her without needing to bend too far. "Mr. Walt," she said in a small voice, "do you think my letter can reach Grandma soon?" He paused, turning toward her with that gentle expression she trusted so much. "I'll do my best, sweetheart," he said, and the warmth in his tone softened the edges of the cold morning. When he bent to retrieve a dropped envelope near his foot, the hem of his coat shifted. A thin sliver of metal caught the light, brighter this time, unmistakable. Emily's eyes widened. She'd seen it before, but now the gleam lingered just long enough for her to make out its curve. Whatever it was, Walt tucked it back into his pocket with a familiar, careful gesture, the kind people used for something that mattered. Before she could ask, Mark stepped in from behind the sorting table, his steps brisk and his expression tight from the pressure building in the room. "Walt," he said, the edge in his voice sharper than it had been earlier, "promises won't fix delays. Please stick to your station." The comment rippled through the room. Someone folded their arms, another shook their head. A pair of teenagers near the back exchanged looks that said more than words could. Walt straightened slowly, nodding once. His shoulders rose and fell with a breath he didn't quite finish. The room's weight settled on him, every glance, every sigh, every impatient shuffle. He didn't defend himself. He didn't push back. He simply accepted it, the way people who'd carried far heavier things tended to do. Emily looked around, her small brow knitting as she watched the reaction swirl. For a moment she hugged her envelope closer, as though holding on to something steady, while the grown-ups shifted restlessly. A woman near the window whispered, "If he can't keep up, they should let someone else handle mornings." Another voice followed, low and weary. "Feels like we're waiting longer every week." The air in the post office grew tight, the kind of tension that didn't need raising voices to be felt. The radiator hissed softly in the corner, filling the quiet that no one dared break. Walt kept his eyes on the mail, but the stillness in his posture said everything. He stood there absorbing each unspoken judgment, each flicker of frustration, as though they landed in the same place they always had, somewhere deep and silent inside him, where he held every hard thing without complaint. Mark's voice cut through the murmur of the post office as he stepped out from behind the counter. "Walt, come with me for a minute," he said, not unkindly, but with the kind of firmness that didn't leave room for hesitation. Walt nodded once, smoothing the front of his worn coat before following him down the short hallway toward the small back room. The door clicked shut behind them, muting the restless shuffling of customers. The room was barely larger than a closet, stacked with boxes of seasonal envelopes, dusty forms no one used anymore, and the faint smell of paper that had lived too long on its shelves. Mark stood near the desk, rubbing the bridge of his nose, as if the morning had already stretched too far. "This isn't working, Walt. People are frustrated." His voice wasn't loud, but the pressure behind it was unmistakable. Walt didn't answer right away. He rested one hand on the pocket of his coat, feeling the familiar curve of the coin beneath the fabric. It sat there the way certain memories do, quiet, steady, and heavy with meaning no one else could see. He kept his eyes on the floor, tracing the grain in the old linoleum with a steadiness that looked like calm, but was something closer to resignation. "I'm trying," he said finally, his voice low. "Just a little slower these days." Mark exhaled sharply. Slow hasn't been the issue for a long time. Folks want things to move. It's not personal. But kindness doesn't fix process. Protocol slammed him today. He wasn't pointing to Walt, but the words still landed in the narrow space between them. Out in the hallway, Emily pressed her ear to the crack between the door and the frame. She shouldn't have been listening, she knew that, but something about Walt's silence felt too heavy to walk away from. Her hands tightened around her envelope as she heard Mark's voice echo through the thin wood. "He's kind. That should matter too," she whispered to herself, though the sound barely rose above breath. Inside, Walt kept still. A faint hum from the overhead light flickered in the quiet. He looked older in that moment, not because of the years he carried, but because of the weight no one else saw. He touched the pocket again, his fingers lingering as if to remind himself the coin was still there, still real, still his. Mark leaned a shoulder against the desk. "I'm not trying to be the bad guy, but when people complain, it comes back to me. And this morning?" He gestured toward the lobby. "You heard them. They're impatient." Walt nodded slowly, as though he'd already accepted whatever the day demanded from him. "I don't want to make your job harder," he said softly. "I know," Mark replied, and for a moment something like sympathy crossed his face. But it vanished just as quickly beneath the weight of responsibility. "Let's just try to keep things moving." Walt gave one more nod and reached for the doorknob. When he stepped back into the hallway, the air felt heavier than when he'd left it. His steps were slower, each one tapping gently against the worn floor, as though he were trying not to disturb the fragile quiet settling around him. Emily stood nearby, eyes wide. She didn't say a word at first. She just walked beside him, her small boots matching his pace with quiet determination, as if keeping step might help carry some part of what he bore. The line had thinned a little, though the tension remained in the air, tucked between unspoken complaints and folded arms. Walt returned to the counter, lifting the next stack of envelopes with the same deliberate care as before, though his shoulders drooped slightly. Emily glanced back at the closed office door. Then up at Walt, something unspoken passed between them. A recognition, a kind of gentle loyalty that didn't need words. The town had judged him, but judgment was about to shift. The lunch-hour rush hit the Maple Junction post office like a tide, pushing in waves of boots, coats, and cold air that swirled beneath the hanging lights. Conversations overlapped, packages thumped onto the counter, and the bell above the door rang so often it seemed almost part of the hum. Mark moved briskly from one workstation to another, trying to stay ahead of the growing crowd. Walt, steady as ever, kept to his quiet rhythm behind the counter, sorting the newest stack of envelopes with the same care he would give something far more fragile. A woman juggling two parcels called out, "Can we get a little help up here?" Mark spun too quickly, snagging his elbow on a cardboard box. The entire stack teetered, then toppled. A large bin filled with mixed mail hit the floor with a hollow thud, spilling letters and forms across the tiles like scattered leaves. The sound cut through the noise, and for a breath, the room paused. Before Mark could bend down, Walt was already there. He lowered himself carefully, knees cracking quietly, and began to gather the loose envelopes with deliberate, gentle movements. His hands hovered over each letter, as if making sure none were bent or crumpled. He didn't speak. He didn't hesitate. He simply helped the way he always did. As he reached for a cluster of postcards, something slipped from his coat pocket. A small metal coin struck the ground with a crisp, ringing note and spun in a bright circle across the tile. People turned instinctively, their eyes following the glint as it rotated, wobbling, then finally settled near Emily's boots. She was closest, and she moved without thinking, dropping to her knees to pick it up. Her fingers closed around the cool metal, and she turned it over in her palm. "Mr. Walt," she said softly, her voice threading into the sudden quiet. "There are words here." Walt froze. Mark looked up sharply, eyes narrowing at the object in Emily's hand. As she held the coin toward him, the warm light overhead caught the engraving. Mark read aloud slower than usual, the words heavy on his tongue. Service beyond duty, Mayor Hamilton, 1999. A murmur rippled through the crowd. It wasn't confusion, it was recognition. Not everyone knew the story, but enough did to shift the air in the room. The shuffle of shoes came from the doorway. Retired County Commissioner Hanley stepped forward, his presence drawing eyes the way certain respected people do without trying. His weathered face tightened with memory as he looked from the coin to Walt. This man, Hanley, said, voice firm enough to steady the room, carried 3 families through that flood. I remember. He took another step, his gaze softening. He saved lives without taking credit. Mark stood silent, shoulders sinking, as if something inside him had been rearranged. The authority he'd held all morning seemed to slip away, passing now to someone who saw the truth first. Hanley moved closer to Walt. With slow, deliberate dignity, he removed his hat and held it to his chest. He didn't speak another word. He didn't need to. The gesture alone filled the room with a quiet reverence, a symbolic salute from someone whose respect meant something here. One by one, people followed. A man near the back placed his hand over his heart. A woman did the same. Even those who didn't fully understand the story felt the shift and mirrored the gesture the way communities sometimes move as a single breath. Walt stayed kneeling for a moment, his hand hovering near the edge of the fallen male. When he finally stood, he brushed his palms on his coat and bowed his head slightly. Just did what needed doing, he said, voice barely above a whisper. The hush that settled over the post office wasn't the impatient quiet from earlier. It was something fuller, warmer, an understanding that hadn't existed an hour ago. The room felt different now, as if every person inside had been invited to see Walt with new eyes. And in that softened space, the energy shifted from judgment to respect. The crowd in the post office lingered longer than usual, as if no one wanted to be the first to break the quiet that had settled after the commissioner's gesture. People shifted slowly back into place, but the impatience from earlier had drained away, replaced by something gentler, like the soft drift of snow against a window pane. An older man near the counter cleared his throat. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried easily in the stillness. We misread you, Walt. Commissioner saw it first. We should have too. His words hung there for a moment, honest and unpolished, and a few people nodded, the weight of recognition touching their faces. Walt stood with the fallen male gathered neatly in his hands, his posture quieter than usual. He looked around with a kind of humble confusion, as though unsure what to do with the attention now settling on him so heavily. His eyes drifted toward Mark, who hadn't spoken since the reveal. Mark stepped forward slowly, each footfall measured. His expression had softened, not the tight, strained patience from earlier, but something closer to regret. He stopped a few feet from Walt, folding his hands together, before letting them fall to his sides. Walt, he began, his voice lower than before, I was wrong. I judged you by speed, not by service. He glanced down for a moment, then back up again. That wasn't fair. Not after everything you've done. A faint smile touched Walt's face, the kind that came from understanding rather than pride. He shook his head once. Everyone has a job to do, he murmured. Yours included. Emily stepped between them, her boots making soft taps on the floor. She still held the coin, Walt's coin, cradled carefully in both hands, as if it were too important to risk dropping. She looked up at him, with the earnestness only a child could carry so openly. Mr. Walt, she said, lifting the coin toward him. Can we put this on the board, so people don't forget? Again, Walt stared at the small, glinting circle for a long moment. He didn't reach for it immediately. His eyes moved over the faces in the room. People who had muttered, sighed, judged, and grown impatient with him just hours earlier. Now those same faces held warmth apology and a kind of gratitude he hadn't expected to see again. Finally, he reached out and took the coin from Emily's hands. His fingers closed around it gently, as if holding a memory rather than metal. "If you think it belongs there," he said softly, "then, yes, we can." Behind him, the atmosphere of the room shifted once more, not sharp or dramatic, but steady, like the way a tide changes direction without fanfare. Conversations resumed in low voices, and someone held the door open for a neighbor struggling with a stack of packages. A young man offered his place in line to an elderly woman. Small gestures, quiet but undeniable. The booty in a place that had so easily fallen into impatience and misjudgment earlier in the day now felt entirely different. The warmth in the air wasn't from the radiators or the lamps overhead. It came from the people themselves, from the way their shoulders had relaxed, from the way their voices had softened. Emily stayed close to Walt as he walked toward the community bulletin board on the far wall. Mark followed at a respectful distance, hands in his pockets, watching with a look that mixed humility with something like admiration. Even the older man who'd spoken first stepped aside to give Walt room. Walt paused in front of the board, the coin resting in his palm. He looked at it one more time, tracing the engraved words with his thumb. Whatever story lived behind those letters, the flood, the families, the night he'd carried more weight than most men ever would, it remained his, alone. But the coin had become something larger now, something that belonged to the town. He lifted it, and the quiet around him deepened. Emily looked up, eyes bright with anticipation. Mark breathed out slowly. A woman near the back clasped her hands together. Outside the windows, the winter light shifted, softening the edges of every shadow, as though the day itself had begun to understand something new. All it took was one person to see him. Emily stood on her tiptoes as she pinned the coin to the center of the community board. The metal caught the warm overhead light, sending a soft reflection across the wall of old flyers and thank you notes. Beside it, she taped a small handwritten card, her letters neat but earnest. "No one stands out of place when kindness leads." She stepped back, studying it with a seriousness far beyond her years. Then she added one more line beneath it, her pencil pressing just a little deeper into the paper. "Sometimes it just takes one person to honor what others overlooked." A few people nearby read the words quietly. Some nodded, some smiled, and some simply looked at Walt with a different kind of understanding than they'd carried in that morning. Commissioner Hanley approached, removing his hat the way he had earlier, but now with a gentler motion. He stood before Walt, offering a slow, respectful nod. It wasn't dramatic, and it wasn't for show. It was the sort of gesture a man gives when he has nothing left to prove, only gratitude to convey. Walt returned the nod, docile, small and almost shy, the way someone reacts when praise feels heavier than any burden he ever carried. Mark hovered a few steps behind hands. In his pockets, his voice lower and quieter than it had been all day. "He saw the truth before the rest of us," he murmured. "I'm glad he spoke up." Walt didn't answer right away. He looked at the board, at the coin now settled among birthday cards, church announcements, and lost pet notices. Yet somehow, it didn't look out of place at all. It looked as if it had always been waiting for that exact spot, waiting for someone to remember its story. He turned toward the exit, moving at his unhurried pace, and Emily trailed him for a few steps before stopping near the door. Snow drifted past the windows, soft flakes catching the glow of the street lamp outside. When Walt stepped onto the porch, the cold brushed his face, but the air felt lighter than it had that morning. He paused under the awning, the wooden boards creaking gently beneath him. The yellow light above cast a steady glow, stretching his shadow across the wet walkway. For a moment, he simply stood there, taking in the quiet of Maple Junction, the way the snow softened every sound, and softened, too, the weight he'd carried for so long. His hand rose almost unconsciously to his chest, where the coin used to rest in his pocket. His fingers touched the fabric lightly, the gesture small but full of memory. And then a faint smile appeared, warm enough to meet the winter air halfway. Behind him, inside the post office, voices had taken on a brighter tone. Someone held the door for a stranger. Someone else laughed softly. The shift echoed through the room and into the cold evening like a truth finally spoken aloud. Walt took a slow breath and stepped forward into the snow, leaving gentle footprints on the sidewalk as he walked toward home, no longer out of place in his own town. If this story moved you, share it forward. The snow outside the Maple Junction post office drifted quietly, and Walt paused beneath the porch light as its glow settled over him like an old winter lamp in a farmhouse window. Inside the coin he once kept hidden now rested on the community board, shining softly beside Emily's handwritten note. A small reminder that kindness, when finally seen, can steady a whole room. Still, he knew the day hadn't changed who he was. It had simply allowed others to catch up to a truth he'd carried with quiet patience. Then, as Commissioner Hanley lifted his hat once more in a gentle echo of honor, Walt felt something shift, light as breath, certain as a promise, and he stepped forward into the snow with a steadier smile. Kicker. No one stands out of place when kindness leads.